Okay, so we are going to talk about the urinary system. And so what I've done is I have divided this up into a urinary system lecture that deals with more the anatomy or the structural part of the urinary system, and then we'll discuss renal physiology as a separate topic. So we need to talk about some functions of the kidneys at first, then we'll go into gross anatomy of the kidneys, and then we'll dive into microscopic anatomy. So to start with, in terms of roles of the kidneys, kidneys are really important to function of the body. And if you think back about some of the other things that we've talked about, when we look at the cardiovascular system, the kidneys take about a quarter of the cardiac output in total. So 25% of blood being pumped from the heart is being routed directly to the kidneys. And that just tells you right there how important the kidneys are. So kidneys are responsible for filtering about 200 liters of fluid from our blood every day. So just for just a second, picture that in your head. 200 liters is a lot of fluid that gets routed through the kidneys. Now, the grand majority of that gets absorbed back into our body, but our kidneys are responsible for processing that. And so as a result, they're going to be able to excrete substances that we don't want to keep in our body, and we're going to reabsorb or reclaim substances that we do want to hold on to. Kidneys are also responsible for maintaining homeostasis within our body, and there's a few ways that they're able to do that. So one of them is regulating the total volume of water within our body, which we know is going to affect blood pressure as well. Kidneys help to regulate the concentration of solutes in our body. They also regulate concentrations of ions in our extracellular fluid. Kidneys are responsible for producing erythropoietin, which is the hormone that stimulates red blood cell production, and renin, which, as we'll see a little later, plays a role in blood pressure. And kidneys are also responsible for the conversion of vitamin D to its active form that our body uses. In terms of anatomy of the urinary system, we're going to go through these organs, but the organs involved are going to be the kidneys, and we have two of them. We have a left and a right. The ureters, which are going to be these long muscular tubes that lead from kidneys down to the urinary bladder, which serves as a storage site for urine, and then the urethra, which conveys urine from the bladder where it's being stored to the outside of the body. Okay. So in terms of where the kidneys are located, they are retroperitoneal. So they are posterior to the abdominal cavity, and they tend to lie about the bottom of the thoracic spine and the beginning of the lumbar spine. So that's about the level that they are. And one of the things that we see is that the right kidney is kind of located a little more inferiorly because that big liver on the right side of the body takes up so much space that it actually moves that right kidney down just a little bit. And also keep in mind that we have the adrenal glands, which we talked about as part of the endocrine system, totally separate glands, and they sit perched on top of each kidney on either side. So each kidney is about the size of a bar of soap, so that kind of gives you an idea of how big these guys are. And the lower ribs do offer some protection. You can see in this posterior view, we've got the lower rib cage here, so about T12 down to about L3, we would have our kidneys sitting. And then you can also see that we've got the right kidney sitting down a little bit lower than the left kidney because of the liver. Okay. When we look at the kidney, we've got this convex surface laterally, so it kind of arches around here, and then the medial surface of the kidney is more concave, so we've got kind of this concavity here. We do have this area on the medial aspect of the kidneys where all of these structures kind of come in and out. So we've got the renal artery and vein, we've got the renal pelvis, which is going to drain into the ureter, And this whole area is called the hilum. And this is very similar to another organ that we talked about who also had a hilum, and that's the hilum of the lung. So it's a very similar setup where on the medial aspect of the organ, you've got a collection of vessels that are coming in and out, and they're basically all kind of targeting that one area. But it's the same thing that we see in the kidneys. This is, I think, an interesting view. This is a CT scan. So this is transverse plane view of the CT scan. And the way that CT scans are always oriented is the patient's feet are towards you. And this is going to be the right side of the body. So this is here. This is going to be the right side of the body, and we can correlate that with what we know. Here's the liver. We know that's on the right side of the body. Here's the left side of the body. This is going to be anterior, so it's going to be the anterior part of the person, and this is posterior. And I always like to point this out because right here we've got a right kidney, and here we've got a left kidney. Here's our spleen on the left side. This right here, what is this signifying here? What do you think that is? So yeah, this is a vertebrae. So this is all the way posterior to your spine, and here's our kidneys, basically, you know, at the level of our spine. So they're very posterior, you know, that's their retroperitoneal positioning. And here anterior to them, we've got all the rest of the organs of the abdominal cavity. But kidneys are very posterior. They lay just right, almost in line with the spine. So I just think that's interesting to kind of see where they are in relation to other organs. In terms of kidney anatomy of the organ itself, kidneys come in 3 layers. That's a common thing that we see a lot in anatomy, right? When in doubt, 3 layers. And the first layer, if we look superficially, we've got renal fascia. And so this is a dense fibrous connective tissue that serves to anchor the kidneys to the structures around it. So it basically is structural. It helps to hold the kidneys in place. Then we have a perirenal fat capsule. And so this is basically just fatty tissue that surrounds the kidneys, and it offers protection for them. And then we have the fibrous capsule, and this is right on the kidney itself. So this is the deepest layer. And this fibrous capsule, it's transparent. So if you actually look at a kidney, it looks kind of like clear and shiny. And what you're seeing is that transparent capsule. And what that does is it helps protect the kidney from infection. So if you think about everything else in that abdominal cavity, all those organs are just kind of crammed in there together. And if you have an area of infection in one area of the abdominal cavity, it could theoretically easily spread to other organs located within that cavity. But here we have this capsule that kind of covers the kidney, and it keeps it separate, and it offers some protection to the kidney. So here's a transverse plane view, and I like this because this does show you those different layers. So here's the kidney here. The first layer just on the outside of the kidney itself is going to be the renal capsule or the fibrous capsule. Then we've got in green here, we've got this fatty tissue layer that serves to protect the kidney. And then we've got the renal fascia here in red. That's dense fibrous connective tissue that's anchoring the kidney to structures around it. If we cut the kidney open and we look on the inside of it, this is basically what we see. And we can divide the kidney up into 3 regions. Again, it all happens in 3s, right? So the first region, the outermost region of the kidney is going to be the cortex. And so that's going to be the kind of this outermost third of the kidney that we see through here. And we see that's a pretty common thing too, right? Think about probably most recently the adrenal cortex. So part of the adrenal gland, it was the outer kind of crust of the organ. So when you have a cortex, it's always going to be that outer part of the organ. Then we've got the renal medulla, which is going to be this area here. So we're going to kind of come in just a little bit and we're going to see medulla, similar to the adrenal medulla. And then the renal pelvis, which is going to be this kind of interior part. If you can see through here, this is the interior part that's ultimately going to drain out through the ureter. So it serves to collect urine from the kidneys, and then is going to convey that out of the kidney through the ureter. So 3 different regions. And here we have on a microscopic level the same thing. This is going to be a frontal plane cut of the kidney, and we can see kind of this outermost crust area here, which is going to be the cortex. Then we get into the innermost part, which is going to be more medulla, and then more interiorly, so kind of in this area through here, would be the pelvis, renal pelvis. Okay, so we're going to divide in each one a little bit more. The renal cortex, like we talked about, is that outer third of the kidney. So there's your crust. It's a little lighter in color, so we do have, on a real kidney, you would see some color change between the cortex and the medulla. The medulla is going to be more this interior part here. And what we see with the medulla is that it's actually divided into these areas here. So you can see these kind of triangular shaped areas, and we call these the renal pyramids. And these are kind of like lobes of the kidney. And so generally each kidney is divided into 8 individual renal pyramids. And what's interesting too is that all these renal pyramids are not always on the same plane in the kidney. So if you cut the kidney in a frontal plane section, sometimes you'll see some of the pyramids, and then if you cut a little deeper, other ones will be visible too. So okay, so when we look at these structures inside the renal medulla, we see that we have these individual renal pyramids, which are going to be kind of these darker colored structures against the lighter color of the cortex. And we have parts of the cortical tissue that actually comes down in between each of the pyramids. You can see kind of that lighter color there. So you kind of see this alternating pattern of color change, and then also these triangular shaped pyramids. So the way that these pyramids are oriented is the apex of the pyramid, so this pointy part here at the bottom, is always going to point down towards the renal pelvis, more internally to the kidney. And then the base of the pyramid, so this flatter part here at the top, is always going to be, you know, kind of directed towards the cortex of the kidney. So what we have, and this is where our lobes come in, is I'd said that each kidney has about 8 lobes, and that's generally what we see. And a lobe consists of a renal pyramid and the cortical tissue that surrounds it. So like this would be one lobe, this would be the next lobe beside it, so that would be the second one. You know, maybe here, renal pyramid with that cortical tissue would be our third lobe. And we would have a total of generally 8 within each kidney. Just another way to look at it. I thought this was a pretty good picture because it highlights like the color change that you see between the cortex, which is a little lighter in color on a kidney, and then your darker colored pyramids kind of, you know, alternating. Okay, so the way that these structures all come together is you have your pyramid, and again here you can see your color change. The pointy part of the pyramid is going to be angled towards the renal pelvis, which is going to be this structure here, and basically that's how urine is going to get conveyed out of the body. But how does it all travel? So it's going to go through some different structures. So the first one is going to be the renal papilla, which is basically going to be the apex of the pyramid. So you've got this little pointy part here, and I'm kind of drawing each of the renal papilla in red. It's going to be the apex of the renal pyramid. Okay, so each pyramid is going to drain into its own renal papilla. And then you have several papilla from several different pyramids that are going to be basically enclosed by these little structures. They're called minor calyces. Minor calyces, or calyx would be singular. And so what these are these are like little cups that basically the urine is going to flow down the renal pyramid into the papilla, and then it's going to go from papilla into this minor calyx. So it's kind of like a little cup that goes right underneath the renal papilla. So the urine's going to drain from the papilla into the minor calyx. And then we have several minor calyces that are going to join and form major calyces. And so each kidney is only going to have like 2 or 3 major calyces. Okay, so we've got minor calyces that are going to drain into major calyces. And then the major calyces are going to drain into the renal pelvis and then out of the kidney, heading down to the bladder through the ureter. Okay, if you look at the renal pyramids under a microscope, they are striped. So they are striated, and this is basically because within each of the pyramids, we've got these microscopic little tubules that run parallel. And so they're basically running in this direction, and they are conveying urine down to the apex of that pyramid so that it can be collected in the renal papilla and then the minor calyx. Okay, and so this is what we see here. This is again cross-section microscopic view, but here's our cortex. So this is the outer crust of the kidney. Here's our medulla, and you can see in this structure here, here's our pyramid, right? So you can see these little lines. Those are the microscopic tubules, and you can see they're all kind of heading down in this direction. Well, here's our papilla, and then this kind of white structure that's lining the papilla would be our minor calyx, and that serves as a kind of a collecting cup for urine. Okay, and then our most internal region of the kidney is going to be the renal pelvis, and so that's going to be this area here, and it's basically kind of like it's like a ductwork system. It's like a drainage system for the kidney, and so this is located again in the hilum of the kidney, so that most kind of medial aspect of the kidney. And what's going to happen is your major calyces, and again, you've only got like 2 or 3 of them per kidney, but they're going to come together and form the renal pelvis. And then the renal pelvis is going to exit the kidney through the ureter, and it's going to basically drain urine from the kidney, and it's heading down to the urinary bladder. So here, I've spelled it out for you again. How does urine drain from the kidney? And so you've got it in order here as we're traveling through the pyramids. It's going to drain into the papilla, or that little pointy part of the pyramid. It's then going to head into a minor calyx, then into a major calyx, and then into the renal pelvis, which is going to be here, and then eventually drain out through the ureter, heading down to the bladder. And it's important to note too that all of these, these aren't just passive tubes. These are actually muscular tubes. So the walls of all these structures contain smooth muscles, and they contract to propel urine down the body along the route heading to the bladder. Okay, so talking about blood supply of the kidneys. Again, like we talked about before, kidneys they are like powerhouses. So they're taking like a quarter of the total cardiac output of our body. So they are hardworking. Think back about blood vessels. So we know, big picture, we have renal arteries that when we learned blood vessels of the abdomen, we had aorta, abdominal aorta traveling down, and then we had a left and a right renal artery supplying each kidney with arterial blood. And that's exactly what we see. So in this picture here, this would be our renal artery traveling into the kidney. Venous blood is drained from the kidney through the renal veins. So here's a renal vein, and so it's going to convey blood from the kidney, and it's going to travel and meet up with the inferior vena cava, which is going to take that venous blood back up to the heart. Okay, so don't forget what you already know. You already know blood supply to the kidneys. Now, one of the things that we do find is that once the renal artery enters the kidney here, it's actually going to divide into smaller and smaller arteries, and they get really, really small. So here's all your divisions: segmental, interlobular, or interlobar, arcuate, cortical radiate arteries, which are basically going to be these tiny little arteries here that we see in the cortex of the kidney. And then what's important here is going to be all of this kind of boxed through here, because this is really going to be where a lot of activity happens. And we're going to talk about that. But we basically have cortical radiate arteries that are going to divide into these tiny, tiny little arterioles leading into a capillary bed, kind of this tangled mess of capillaries. And then the efferent arteriole is going to lead away from that capillary bed, and then eventually joining larger and larger veins to become the renal vein, and then eventually dumping or draining into inferior vena cava and back to the heart. But this is kind of our important part through here, and we'll talk about that when we get to the microscopic anatomy. Kidneys are innervated, and again, that's something that we've talked about before. There is autonomic nervous system innervation to the kidneys, and it's primarily in the form of sympathetic nervous system. And so if you think about this, apply this to what we talked about before with the heart and blood flow and cardiac output. If you are running away from a bear in a parking lot and your sympathetic nervous system is activated, is it important at that point in time to route a lot of blood to your kidneys? It really isn't. And so they're going to decrease blood flow to the kidneys through vasoconstriction, because we know that's what sympathetic nervous system does. It vasoconstricts. And at that point too, we've got less blood flow going to the kidneys. So we are going to generate decreased urine, because at that point in time, it's not so important that we're forming urine. So that's what happens with sympathetic activation of the kidneys. So let's dive into a little bit more of the microscopic anatomy. We were talking big picture. Now let's dive in and look at some of these smaller structures. So kidneys contain nephrons, and each kidney is going to contain like over 1 million nephrons. This is the microscopic structural and functional unit of the kidney. This is where the magic happens, because this is the structure that allows for the formation of urine. So each nephron is going to consist of a renal corpuscle and a renal tubule. So when we combine these two structures together, it's going to create a nephron for us. So we'll talk about that. Let's talk first about the renal corpuscle. So the renal corpuscle is going to be located in the renal cortex. So if you think about it, here's our kidney, right? Here's our hilum with our structures going in and out, and we've got that outer third of the kidney, that cortex, and this area here is going to be where this renal corpuscle is located. A renal corpuscle is going to consist of two structures. One of them is the glomerulus, and what the glomerulus is it's basically this network of capillaries. It looks like this tangled mess of capillaries. In fact, if we look at this picture, this right here, this little tangled mess of capillaries is the glomerulus. That's what it looks like. So it's this tangled mess of capillaries, and it's created by afferent arterioles that are branching from the cortical radiate arteries. So if you go back a couple slides and look at those blood vessels, that's where we are kind of along the sequence of vessels there. Now, the type of capillary that creates the glomerulus is a fenestrated capillary. So think back, we've talked before about three types of capillaries, right? We had continuous capillaries, we had sinusoid capillaries, and then we had fenestrated capillaries. And we know that kind of the highlight of fenestrated capillaries is that they have pores. And that's exactly what we see here. So if you go back to look at your types of capillaries, you're going to find that fenestrated capillaries are located in areas where we have to do filtration and absorption. And that's exactly what our kidneys are doing for us. So it makes sense. This is a great example of complementarity, that the capillaries that we see in the kidneys are fenestrated capillaries. Okay, the second part of the renal corpuscle is the glomerular capsule. Okay, and this is also known as Bowman's capsule. So that's the same. It's the same thing. We can just call it a couple different names. And so what we see here is that the glomerular capsule basically surrounds the glomerulus. Okay, so if you think back, our glomerulus is that tangled mess of capillaries. So I always kind of draw it like this. Here's my glomerulus. It's my tangled mess of capillaries, and we've got an arteriole, leading into it, and another arteriole that's leading out of it, and blood's flowing all through this tangled mess of capillaries. So around that tangled mess of capillaries, we have a capsule. And so basically, it's going to surround the capillary bed kind of like this, and then head out. And we're heading in this direction. Okay, so glomerular capsule is going to cup around the glomerulus. And this capsule has two layers. So a lot of things in our body have two layers. And so that's something that we're familiar with. It's going to have a visceral layer. And in this case, the visceral layer is going to be the part of the capsule that is attached to the actual capillary, to the capillary through here. Okay, now these are special types of cells. So these are epithelial cells, and they have what's called podocytes. And podocytes are these cells that have foot processes at the end, where they basically connect the visceral layer of the capsule to the capillary wall, and it creates these slits in between those two structures that allow filtrate, which is going to be the liquidy substance, to move from the capillary into the capsule. Okay, and we'll look at this in a couple different ways. The second layer of Bowman's capsule is the parietal layer. And so the parietal layer is going to be comprised of simple squamous epithelium, and it's basically lining the internal kind of edge of the glomerular capsule there. So parietal layer is going to be through here. The visceral layer is actually going to be right on top of the capillary itself. So let's look at this a couple different ways. Just to orient you, here is my arteriole leading into the glomerulus. This right here is my tangled knot of capillary. So this is my glomerulus, and then here's my arteriole leading away from that capillary bed. Okay, here is Bowman's capsule. So again, it kind of comes up and it's kind of like, you know, located around the glomerulus. It kind of surrounds it. And we've got two layers of Bowman's capsule. So we've got a parietal layer, which is going to be this layer here. It kind of lines Bowman's capsule. And then we've got a visceral layer, which is going to be right on top of the tangled mess of capillaries. Okay, and so this is what we see here. This is again in a little different view. Here is this area here is going to be the glomerulus, which is capillary. And again, it's fenestrated. So there's our fenestrated capillary. We've got a basement membrane that's basically connecting these two structures. And then we've got the podocyte that is part of the visceral layer of Bowman's capsule. Okay, so that's going to be visceral layer of Bowman's capsule. So we've got those three structures that are kind of lined up together, and they create something very special. And this is going to all sound familiar in just a minute. If we take a closer look, this is what we see with that visceral layer of Bowman's capsule. So here's our visceral layer. It's shown here in this yellow, and you can see these little kind of structures that are projecting from those epithelial cells. These are the foot processes of the podocytes of the visceral layer. And then if we look at the capillary itself, that's the structure here that you can see in red. You see the little holes that are located in that capillary. Well, that's showing you the pores. And so those are specifically the fenestrations of the capillary, and that's what makes it a fenestrated capillary. Okay, another view. Obviously, I think that this is actually kind of cool to look at, but here's our capillary lumen. Here's the pores indicating the fenestrated capillary of the glomerulus. Here's our kind of middle basement membrane in between the two. And then here are these filtration slits between podocytes, or between foot processes of the podocytes in the visceral layer of the capsule, of Bowman's capsule. So basically what's going to happen is substances are going to travel from the capillary. They're going to go out through these pores, and they're going to travel right in between those filtration slits and into Bowman's capsule. So that's, this is the direction of flow that they're going to be traveling in. Okay. Couple other views. Obviously, I think they're cool to look at. But basically what this creates is a filtration membrane. And so this should sound really familiar because we just finished respiratory system not too long ago, and we had a respiratory membrane, right? We had a membrane that was formed between the capillaries in the lungs, the fused basement membrane, and then the alveoli, the wall of the alveoli, right? So three structures that were all kind of merged together, forming this thin membrane that would allow in the lungs gases to diffuse across. In the kidney, it's a little bit different, but the general concept is the same. So here we have the same thing. This is our filtration membrane because it's in the kidney, and that's what kidneys do. They filter, and the filtration membrane is in three layers. So we've got the capillary wall, or that capillary endothelium, which in this case, it's going to be a fenestrated capillary wall. We've got the basement membrane. That's going to be connecting these two structures together. And what's kind of interesting is that the basement membrane, in this case, carries a negative charge because what we find is that proteins in the body are negatively charged. And we want proteins in our body to stay in our body. We don't want to lose them through our kidneys. So the basement membrane carries a negative charge. So it, in essence, repels those negatively charged proteins so that we keep our proteins in our body. They don't leave our body through our kidneys in the best of circumstances. Those pores in the capillaries, I do want to point out that basically it allows everything but blood cells to pass through. We shouldn't be we shouldn't find white blood cells in our urine either, but basically it allows everything but large cells to pass through. And then the third part of our filtration membrane here is going to be the foot processes of the podocytes that are located in the visceral layer of the capsule. And so this is where you have those, those thin slits where substances, can travel right in between. But there is a little bit of protection there too, because there's this membrane that occurs right at the entrance to those slits. And so that's going to prevent any large molecules from passing through. Okay, so in a slightly different view here, here's showing us the three layers of that filtration membrane. Here's our capillary, and we know, again, it's fenestrated, so here's a pore in that fenestrated capillary. Substances are going to move from the bloodstream in that capillary. They're going to travel through that pore. They're going to travel across. This structure in blue here is the fused basement membrane. And then we can see here's our foot processes here and here. Okay, the foot processes of the podocytes. And we can see that they create holes in between, which are called filtration slits. And then there's a little line going across each filtration slit, and that's that membrane. Okay, that's going to prevent the large molecules from traveling across. But other things can travel across. So we're going to go from the plasma and right through that filtration slit. And now at this point, we are inside the Bowman's capsule, and we're ready to go through the rest of the process.